It was a warm Tuesday afternoon when Marcus Johnson stepped out of Westfield High's gymnasium. The 18-year-old wiped sweat from his forehead. Basketball practice had been intense today. Coach Williams pushed the team hard with regional championships only 3 weeks away. Marcus, the team's starting point guard, had stayed an extra 30 minutes to practice his three-pointers. Now the sun was starting to set as Marcus walked along Maple Street. He wore his school's blue and white basketball shorts and a gray hoodie, his gym bag slung over one shoulder. He had his headphones on, listening to his pre-game playlist while checking text messages from his mother asking if he wanted chicken or fish for dinner. Marcus approached the crosswalk at the intersection of Maple and Fifth. The pedestrian signal showed the walking man, so he stepped into the street. He was halfway across when a police cruiser suddenly pulled up beside him, siren briefly chirping. Marcus stopped and removed his headphones. Officer Richard Dawson stepped out of the vehicle. He was a stocky white man in his 40s with a crew cut and small, hard eyes. "You think you can just walk wherever you want?" Dawson asked, his voice immediately confrontational. Marcus looked confused. "Sir, I had the walk signal." "Don't get smart with me, boy," Dawson said, stepping closer. "I saw you jaywalking." Several people on the sidewalk slowed down, watching the interaction. A woman in a red coat took out her phone and began recording. "I wasn't jaywalking, sir," Marcus replied respectfully, the way his father had always taught him to speak to police officers. "The signal was white when I started crossing." Officer Dawson's face hardened. "ID. Now." Marcus slowly reached for his wallet. "I'm just coming from basketball practice at Westfield High. I'm a student there." "Did I ask where you were coming from?" Dawson snapped. "Just show me some ID before I take you in." Marcus handed over his school ID card. "I don't have my driver's license with me, sir. I'm walking home." Dawson glanced at the ID, then back at Marcus with obvious disdain. "So you think because you play basketball, rules don't apply to you?" "No, sir. I respect the rules." Marcus remained calm, though his heart was racing. More people had gathered now. A man in a business suit stepped closer. "Officer, the kid had the right-of-way. I saw it." "Stay out of this." Dawson barked at the man, then turned back to Marcus. "Put your hands on the hood of my car." "What? Why?" Marcus asked, genuinely shocked. Without warning, Officer Dawson grabbed Marcus's arm roughly and twisted it. When Marcus instinctively pulled back from the pain, Dawson slapped him hard across the face. "You think you can resist?" Dawson shouted, his face inches from Marcus's. "You people never learn." The slap echoed in the suddenly silent street. Marcus's cheek burned red as he stood stunned, hand touching his face in disbelief. "Officer Dawson, badge number 4872. A woman called out loudly as she recorded. "We all saw that." Several more phones were out now, capturing the scene. Dawson glanced around, suddenly aware of the audience. His radio crackled with a call from dispatch. "You're lucky," Dawson muttered to Marcus, shoving his ID back at him. "Get out of here. Next time, watch where you're walking." Dawson returned to his cruiser and drove away, leaving Marcus standing in the intersection, shaken and humiliated. What Officer Dawson didn't know, what he couldn't have guessed looking at the teenager in basketball clothes, was that Marcus Johnson was the only son of Police Captain Robert Johnson, head of internal affairs, and one of the most respected officers in the department's history. And by tomorrow morning, the video of this incident would be everywhere. Marcus walked the remaining 6 blocks home in a daze, his cheeks still stung from Officer Dawson's slap. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation and anger churning inside him. 3 people had approached him after the incident, offering their contact information as witnesses. A woman named Tanya had already sent him the video she recorded. The 2-story brick house on Evergreen Lane came into view. For the first time in his life, Marcus hesitated before entering his own home. His father had always been his hero, the man who taught him to ride a bike, who cheered loudest at his games, who stayed up late helping with math homework. But Captain Robert Johnson was also a cop, part of the same system that had just treated Marcus like a criminal for simply walking home. Marcus took a deep breath and opened the front door. "That you, honey?" his mother called from the kitchen. The smell of baked chicken filled the house. "Dinner's almost ready." "Yeah, Mom," Marcus answered, trying to keep his voice steady. When he entered the kitchen, Lisa Johnson turned from the stove and immediately dropped the wooden spoon she was holding. "Marcus, what happened to your face?" She rushed over, gently touching his swollen cheek. "It's nothing, Mom." "Don't you nothing me. That is not nothing." His mother's eyes flashed with concern and anger. Captain Johnson walked in from his home office, still in his uniform pants and white undershirt, reading glasses perched on his nose. "What's going on?" When he looked up and saw Marcus's face, his expression changed instantly from curiosity to alarm. "Someone tell me what happened," he demanded, his voice quiet but firm. Marcus's eyes burned with unshed tears. "A cop, Dad. A cop happened." They moved to the living room where Marcus showed them the video on his phone. His mother gasped when Officer Dawson slapped her son. His father watched in complete silence, his face unreadable except for a muscle twitching in his jaw. When the video ended, Captain Johnson asked in his professional voice, "Did he identify himself?" "Badge number 4872. Dawson." Captain Johnson's eyes widened slightly. He knew Dawson, a 15-year veteran with 3 previous complaints of excessive force, all dismissed for insufficient evidence. "He didn't know who I was, Dad," Marcus said. "He just saw a young black man." His father finished the sentence. "I know." "What are you going to do, Robert?" Lisa asked, her arm around Marcus's shoulders. Captain Johnson stood up slowly, looking older than his 47 years. For 2 decades, he had worked his way up through the ranks, becoming the department's first black captain 5 years ago. He had taken over internal affairs believing he could change the system from within. Now his own son bore the mark of that system's failure. "First, I'm going to call Chief Williams," he said, picking up his phone. "Then I'm going to make sure every officer in this city sees that video." "Will anything actually happen?" Marcus asked, doubt clear in his voice. "You always say the good cops outnumber the bad ones, but where were they today?" The captain paused, the weight of his son's words hitting him hard. This wasn't just another case file, this was his boy. "I can't promise what will happen," he answered honestly. "But I promise you this, it won't be buried or forgotten." His phone rang 3 times before the chief answered. "Jim, it's Robert Johnson. We have a situation." His voice was calm, but carried unmistakable authority. "One of our officers assaulted my son today. Yes, my son. I have video evidence and multiple witnesses." He paused, listening. "No, I won't be handling the investigation. That would be a conflict of interest. But I will be watching every step of it, as a father and as the head of internal affairs." When he hung up, Captain Johnson sat beside Marcus and did something rare. He took off his badge and placed it on the coffee table. "Tonight, I'm not a police captain," he said. "I'm just your dad. And I need you to know that what happened to you today was wrong. It was dead wrong." For the first time since the incident, Marcus let his tears fall. By 8:30 the next morning, the police station buzzed with unusual activity. Captain Johnson had arrived at 7:00 a.m., earlier than his normal time, dressed in his full uniform with every button perfectly aligned. His face showed no emotion as he walked through the squad room, but officers noticed how people moved out of his way more quickly than usual. Chief Williams called an emergency meeting in the conference room with the department's senior officers. "This is a serious situation," Chief Williams began, his gray eyebrows drawn together in concern. "I've seen the video, and I know many of you have too. It's already on 3 local news stations." On the wall-mounted TV, the morning news played silently. The headline at the bottom read, "Police officer caught on video slapping teenager." Marcus's school photo appeared beside a still image from the incident. Officer Richard Dawson walked in 15 minutes late, his uniform wrinkled as if hastily put on. He froze when he saw Captain Johnson sitting at the table. "Sit down, Officer Dawson," Chief Williams ordered. Dawson slowly took his seat, eyes darting nervously around the room. "Chief, if this is about that kid yesterday, he was jaywalking and then got aggressive when—" "Stop talking," Captain Johnson said quietly. The room fell silent. "The kid you assaulted was my son." All color drained from Dawson's face. "Captain, I had no idea." "Would it have mattered?" Johnson asked. "If he wasn't my son, would that make what you did acceptable?" Before Dawson could answer, the door opened and Lieutenant Sarah Chen from Professional Standards entered with a folder. "We've recovered dashboard camera footage that matches the civilian videos," she reported. "It clearly shows Marcus Johnson had the right-of-way in the crosswalk. There was no jaywalking. We also have statements from 7 witnesses, all confirming the same sequence of events." Chief Williams nodded grimly. "Officer Dawson, effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending full investigation. Badge and gun, please." "This is ridiculous," Dawson protested, standing up. "It's being blown out of proportion because he's the captain's kid." Captain Johnson remained seated, his voice steady. "Officer Dawson, I have formally recused myself from all aspects of this investigation precisely to avoid any suggestion of special treatment. Lieutenant Chen will lead the investigation with oversight from the Civilian Review Board. We're also reviewing your previous complaints," Chen added, opening her folder. 3 excessive force allegations in the past 5 years, all involving minority subjects. Those were all dismissed." Dawson's face reddened. Yes, Captain Johnson finally stood, his full height towering over Dawson. "They were dismissed. And I want to know why." Outside the station, a small crowd of protesters had gathered with signs reading "Justice for Marcus" and "No more police brutality." Local news crews captured footage of Dawson leaving the building, his face hidden behind sunglasses as he pushed past reporters shouting questions. Across town at Westfield High, Marcus sat in his AP history class, trying to ignore the whispers and stares from classmates who had seen the video. His phone kept buzzing with messages of support and interview requests from news outlets. During lunch, his basketball teammates surrounded him protectively. His best friend Jamal pushed away a freshman trying to take a picture. "You okay, man?" Jamal asked. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. "My dad says the officer's been suspended." "Good," Jamal said. "He should be fired and arrested." Marcus's phone rang, his father calling. He stepped away to answer. "Dad?" "Just checking on you," Captain Johnson said. "How's school going?" "Everyone's seen the video," Marcus replied. "It's weird being, the center of attention for something like this." There was a pause before his father spoke again. "The investigation is moving forward. But there's something else you should know. I'm looking into Dawson's previous cases. This might be bigger than just what happened to you." "What do you mean?" "I mean, sometimes it takes one clear case to expose a pattern. Your video might help others who weren't believed." Captain Johnson's voice softened. "I'm proud of how you're handling this, son." As Marcus hung up, he noticed a group of teachers watching him from across the cafeteria. His basketball coach approached, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. "Whatever you need, Johnson," Coach Williams said. "The whole school's behind you." For the first time since the incident, Marcus felt something shift inside him. His pain and humiliation were transforming into something else. A determination to see this through, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been in his position without a police captain for a father or a video to prove their truth. 3 days after the incident, the police department headquarters became a house divided. Captain Johnson walked through the hallway toward his office, noticing how conversations stopped when he passed. Some officers nodded respectfully. Others looked away, their silence speaking volumes. As he reached his office, Officer Marquez approached him with a coffee. "Rough morning, Captain?" she asked, handing him the cup. "Getting rougher by the hour," Captain Johnson admitted. "Thanks, Marquez." Inside his office, Lieutenant Chen waited with a stack of folders. "Sir, I pulled Dawson's complete record," she said, closing the door behind him. "It's worse than we thought. Besides the 3 complaints we knew about, there are 5 more that never made it to formal review. They were handled informally by his supervising sergeant." Captain Johnson took a deep breath. "Let me guess, Sergeant Mills?" Chen nodded. "The same. They graduated from the academy together." The tension in the department was palpable. Several officers had signed a petition supporting Dawson, claiming he was being railroaded because of who Marcus's father was. Others, particularly younger officers and officers of color, had privately approached Captain Johnson to express their support. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. News outlets wanted interviews. Social media users sent him hundreds of messages, most supportive, some hateful. His mother had taken time off work to screen calls and keep reporters away from their house. At school, Marcus tried to maintain normalcy, but it was impossible. Walking into history class, he overheard two students talking. "My dad says the cop was just doing his job," one boy said. "These things get blown out of proportion." Marcus stopped in his tracks. The boy looked up and realized Marcus had heard everything. His face turned red. "Is that what your dad thinks?" Marcus asked quietly, that being slapped for crossing the street legally is part of the job. The classroom fell silent. The boy looked down at his desk. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "I didn't mean." "It's fine." Marcus cut him off, taking his seat. But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. After school, Jamal drove Marcus home. They pulled up to find a news van parked across the street. "Want me to chase them off?" Jamal asked, half serious. Marcus shook his head. "They'll just come back." Inside, he found his mother on the phone and his father sitting at the kitchen table, still in uniform, looking through files. "How bad is it?" Marcus asked, dropping his backpack on a chair. Captain Johnson looked up, the circles under his eyes darker than yesterday, the department splitting into camps. "Some officers think I'm pushing too hard because you're my son. Others think I'm not pushing hard enough for the same reason." "And what do you think?" Marcus asked. His father closed the file. "I think this stopped being just about you the moment I started digging. Dawson has a history, and he's been protected. That ends now." The doorbell rang. Lisa Johnson hung up her call and looked through the peephole. "It's Sergeant Mills," she said, looking at her husband with concern. Captain Johnson's expression hardened. "Let him in." Sergeant Mills entered, looking uncomfortable in the Johnson family home. He nodded at Marcus, then turned to the captain. "Robert, we need to talk. Privately." "Anything you have to say, you can say in front of my family," Captain Johnson replied firmly. Mills shifted his weight. "This witch hunt against Dawson needs to stop. He's a good cop who made one mistake." "One mistake?" Marcus spoke up, surprising everyone including himself. "How many mistakes like that has he made before? How many didn't have videos?" Mills glared at Marcus. "You don't understand how things work, kid." "Don't talk to my son like that in our home." Lisa Johnson stepped forward, her eyes flashing with anger. Captain Johnson stood, towering over Mills. "The investigation continues, by the book. If that's all you came to say, you can leave now." After Mills left, an uncomfortable silence filled the kitchen. Finally, Marcus spoke. "Dad, what happens if nothing changes? What if he gets away with it like all the other times?" Captain Johnson looked at his son, this child he had raised to believe in justice, in right and wrong, in a system he had dedicated his life to improving. "He won't," Captain Johnson promised. "Not this time." But as he said it, he wondered if it was a promise he could actually keep. 1 week after the incident, the Westfield Community Center buzzed with activity. The town hall meeting was scheduled to start at 7:00 p.m., but by 6:30, every seat was taken. People stood along the walls, their murmured conversations creating a constant hum throughout the room. Mayor Rivera sat at the center of a long table on the stage, flanked by Chief Williams and 3 city council members. A chair remained empty, the one reserved for Captain Johnson. In the audience, Marcus sat between his mother and Jamal. He wore a button-down shirt and tie, fidgeting nervously with his cuffs. This would be his first time speaking publicly about what happened. "You sure you want to do this?" his mother whispered, squeezing his hand. Marcus nodded. "I have to." The side door opened, and Captain Johnson walked in. He wasn't in uniform. Instead, he wore a simple navy suit with no tie. Several officers in the audience sat up straighter, surprised to see their captain dressed as a civilian. Instead of taking his place at the officials' table, Captain Johnson made his way through the crowd and sat down next to Marcus. The room fell silent. Mayor Rivera leaned into her microphone. Captain Johnson, your seat is up here." Captain Johnson shook his head. "Tonight I'm not here as a police captain, Mayor. I'm here as a father." A murmur ran through the crowd. Chief Williams frowned but said nothing. The meeting began with the mayor's statement about community policing and the importance of trust. As she spoke, Marcus noticed how many people were watching his father rather than the mayor. When it was time for public comments, Marcus was the first to approach the microphone. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice remained steady. "My name is Marcus Johnson. 1 week ago, I was walking home from basketball practice when Officer Dawson stopped me. He described the incident in simple, factual terms, his words carrying more weight than any emotional appeal could have. I've always been taught to respect police officers," Marcus continued. "My father is a police captain. I grew up around cops. I know most of them are good people who want to help. But what happened to me wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was wrong." From the audience, an older white man called out, "If you just followed orders, none of this would have happened." Before anyone could respond, Captain Johnson stood up. "May I speak?" he asked, walking to stand beside his son. Mayor Rivera nodded, clearly uncomfortable with how the meeting was unfolding. "For 25 years, I've worn the badge with pride," Captain Johnson began. "I've trained officers to treat every person with dignity and respect. But what happened to my son shows we still have work to do." He looked directly at the man who had called out. "Sir, I've reviewed all the evidence. My son did follow orders. He provided ID, he was respectful, he was still slapped across the face for nothing more than walking while black." The room fell silent. "What makes this case different isn't that it happened to my son," Captain Johnson continued. "What makes it different is that we have video evidence and multiple witnesses. Too many similar incidents go unreported or unbelieved." From the back of the room, a young black woman stood up. "What about all the other cases? My brother was harassed last year, but no one believed him." Chief Williams leaned forward. "We investigate every complaint." "No," Captain Johnson interrupted. "We don't, and that's the problem." He turned to face the entire audience. "As part of this investigation, we've uncovered multiple complaints against Officer Dawson that were improperly dismissed. We're reopening all of them." Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. Several officers near the back stood up and walked out. "My father taught me that a badge is a responsibility, not a shield," Marcus said, finding new confidence. "If we want change, we need to hold everyone accountable, even the people who are supposed to protect us." As Marcus and his father returned to their seats, the community center erupted in applause. Not everyone joined in. Some sat with arms crossed. Others whispered angrily to neighbors. But for the first time since the incident, Marcus felt something like hope. The divide was clear, but at least now people were talking about it openly. And that was a start. 2 weeks after the town hall meeting, Officer Richard Dawson sat alone at the defendant's table in the police department's formal hearing room. The room was designed to look like a courtroom, with its wood-paneled walls and raised platform where the 3-member disciplinary board sat. The American flag hung behind them, next to the city flag. Dawson had shaved carefully that morning and wore his dress uniform with all decorations. His attorney, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses named Harold Bennett, arranged papers on the table beside him. "Remember, stick to the script," Bennett whispered. "You felt threatened. You responded according to training, and you had no idea who the boy was." Chief Williams, serving as head of the disciplinary board, called the hearing to order. "Officer Richard Dawson, you face allegations of excessive force, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violation of department policies regarding proper interaction with citizens. How do you respond?" Dawson stood. "Not guilty on all counts, sir." Lieutenant Chen presented the case methodically. First came the civilian videos, then the dashboard camera footage. The room was silent as they watched Officer Dawson slap Marcus across the face. Chen then called 3 witnesses who had been present that day. "He just walked up and started harassing the kid," testified Tanya Williams, the woman in the red coat who had recorded the first video. "The boy was respectful the whole time. There was no reason for any of it." When it was Dawson's turn to defend himself, he took the stand with practiced confidence. "I observed what appeared to be jaywalking," he stated. "When I approached the subject, he became argumentative and made a sudden movement I perceived as threatening." "Is that movement visible in any of the videos we've seen?" Chen asked. Dawson shifted in his seat. "Not clearly, no. In fact, the videos show Marcus Johnson standing still with his hands visible at all times, don't they?" "Videos don't show everything," Dawson insisted. Chen nodded to a clerk who wheeled in a cart with several file boxes. "Officer Dawson, are you familiar with these cases?" Bennett stood quickly. "Objection." Previous incidents are not relevant to today's hearing. They establish a pattern of behavior, Chen countered, and they've all been reopened as part of this investigation. Chief Williams conferred briefly with the other board members. We'll allow it. Chen opened the first file. In 2022, you were accused of using excessive force against James Torres, a Latino man who was sitting in his parked car. The complaint was dismissed by Sergeant Mills with no formal investigation. Can you explain why? Dawson looked toward the back of the room where Sergeant Mills sat, face red with anger or embarrassment. I don't recall that incident, Dawson said. What about Miguel Diaz in 2023 or Tyrone Washington last year? Chen placed each file on the table in front of Dawson. All minorities, all claiming unprovoked aggression from you, all complaints buried. Dawson's confident facade began to crack. This is a witch hunt because the kid is Captain Johnson's son. From the audience, Marcus watched Dawson's growing frustration. He felt strangely calm now, seeing the officer who had humiliated him squirming under questioning. Officer Dawson, Chen continued relentlessly, did you use racial slurs during your interaction with Marcus Johnson? Absolutely not, Dawson protested. Chen played an enhanced audio version of the video where Dawson could clearly be heard saying, "You people never learn." What did you mean by you people, Officer Dawson? The room was completely silent. Dawson looked around at the faces watching him, including officers who had initially supported him but now looked uncomfortable or disappointed. I meant teenagers, Dawson said weakly. A low murmur of disbelief rippled through the room. After 3 hours of testimony, the board called a recess to deliberate. Marcus and his mother waited in the hallway. Officers passed by, some nodding respectfully, others avoiding eye contact. Sergeant Mills approached them unexpectedly. Mrs. Johnson, he said, his voice subdued. I want you to know. I never saw the videos before today. If I had known it was this bad. He trailed off, unable to finish his weak justification. Lisa Johnson looked at him coolly. But you didn't need to see a video to believe the other victims, did you? Mills had no answer for that. When the board returned, their decision was unanimous. Termination recommended, with findings sent to the district attorney for potential criminal charges. As Dawson was escorted out, he looked directly at Marcus for the first time, not with remorse, but with smoldering resentment. Marcus met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away. The battle was far from over, but today, the truth had won. 1 month after Officer Dawson's termination, Captain Johnson stood before 30 police officers in the department's training room. The walls, once bare except for department policies and procedures, now displayed new posters. Change doesn't happen overnight, Captain Johnson began, pacing slowly in front of the group. But it has to start somewhere. This was the first session of the department's new mandatory training program, one of several reforms Captain Johnson had proposed and Chief Williams had approved under mounting public pressure. The officers' faces showed mixed emotions. Some leaned forward with interest, others sat back with arms crossed. For too long, we talked about a few bad apples, Johnson continued, but we haven't talked enough about the system that protects them. At the back of the room, Sergeant Mills shifted uncomfortably in his seat. After Dawson's hearing, an internal investigation had revealed Mills had buried complaints against several officers, not just Dawson. He had been demoted and placed on probation, a punishment many thought too light, but still unprecedented in the department's history. Some of you may think these changes are happening only because my son was involved, Captain Johnson acknowledged, addressing the elephant in the room. And you're partly right. When it happened to my family, I couldn't look away anymore. None of us should have been looking away before. Across town at Westfield High, Marcus sat in the library with 12 other students. They had formed a new organization called Bridge, building relationships in diverse group environments. What had started as a support group for Marcus had evolved into something bigger. The community patrol ride-along is confirmed for next Saturday, Marcus told the group, checking his notebook. 10 spots for students, paired with 5 officers who volunteered. Are you sure this isn't just for show? Asked Kiara, a junior who had been vocal about her distrust of police reform efforts. Officers on their best behavior because they know we're watching. Marcus understood her skepticism. Maybe, But Officer Rodriguez is participating, and she's been pushing for community engagement for years. And so is Officer Marquez, who was the first to support my dad when everything happened. What about your petition? Jamal asked. 300 signatures so far, Marcus replied. The school board agreed to review our proposal for a community police relations section in social studies classes. Marcus had discovered something unexpected in these past weeks. His painful experience had given him a voice, and people were listening. The student who had once focused solely on basketball and grades now found himself leading meetings with the principal, speaking at city council sessions, and even interviewing with the local news. Back at the police station, Captain Johnson wrapped up the training session and asked for questions. Officer Diaz, a young patrol officer, raised his hand. Sir, with respect, how do we know these changes will stick? What happens when public attention moves on to something else? It was the question Johnson had been waiting for, the one he asked himself every night. That's where accountability comes in, he answered. We're installing dashboard and body cameras for every officer and establishing a civilian review board with real power. He paused. But the most important change has to happen in here. He tapped his temple, then his chest. When we see fellow officers crossing the line, silence can't be our response anymore. That blue wall of silence, it protects the worst among us at the expense of the best. As the officers filed out, some stopped to talk with Captain Johnson, asking follow-up questions or sharing their own ideas. Others left quickly, their resistance still evident. Change wouldn't come easily or completely, but it had begun. That evening, the Johnson family sat down for dinner together, a rare occurrence in recent weeks given their busy schedules. Lisa had made Robert's favorite pot roast, and Marcus had actually put his phone away without being asked. I got a call from the mayor today, Captain Johnson said between bites. The city council unanimously approved our budget request for the new training programs and equipment. That's great, Dad, Marcus said. My group is presenting to the school board next week. Lisa looked at her husband and son, both working in their own ways to fix a broken system, both changed by what had happened. I'm proud of you both, she said simply. This isn't just about what happened to Marcus anymore, is it? Captain Johnson shook his head. It never really was. It was just what finally opened our eyes. For the first time in weeks, they talked and laughed through dinner without mentioning Officer Dawson or police reforms or community meetings. For a few hours, they were just a family again. 6 months after the incident that changed everything, Marcus Johnson stood at the podium in the Westfield High School auditorium. Behind him sat members of Bridge, now 30 students strong, alongside Principal Warren and representatives from the police department, including his father. 6 months ago, I was just a student who played basketball and worried about college applications. Marcus began, his voice carrying confidently through the packed room. Then one afternoon, I became something else, a victim, a headline, a symbol. The audience listened in respectful silence. Local news cameras recorded from the back of the room. What had happened to Marcus Johnson was now a case study in police reform, discussed in criminal justice classes across the state. Today, I'm proud to announce that our police student dialogue program will expand to all 5 high schools in the district, Marcus continued. Over 200 students have participated so far, and 15 officers have volunteered their time. In the front row, Lisa Johnson wiped a tear from her eye. Beside her sat Tanya Williams, the woman who had recorded the original video. They had become friends during the months of hearings and meetings. But our work isn't finished, Marcus said, his expression growing more serious. Last week, Officer Richard Dawson's criminal trial ended with a guilty verdict for assault. He received probation instead of jail time. A murmur ran through the audience. Many felt the sentence was too light. Others thought any conviction of a police officer was progress. Some people see this as a failure, Marcus acknowledged. But I see it differently. For the first time in our city's history, an officer was actually held accountable in court. That matters. Captain Johnson sat straight-backed in his chair on stage. The past 6 months had changed him as much as they had changed his son. His hair showed more gray now, and the lines around his eyes had deepened. The stress had taken its toll, but so had the purpose. Under his leadership, the department had implemented significant changes. All officers now wore body cameras. Complaints were processed through an independent review board. De-escalation training was mandatory, but perhaps most importantly, the culture had begun to shift. Change is hard, Marcus continued. Some officers resigned rather than adapt to the new policies, but others have embraced the chance to rebuild trust. And community members who once avoided police are now willing to talk. In the back of the auditorium stood Officer Marquez, now promoted to sergeant after Officer Mills' demotion. Next to her stood Officer Rodriguez, who had become the department's community outreach coordinator. They nodded in agreement as Marcus spoke. As Marcus concluded his speech, he asked all bridge members to stand. The diverse group of students rose to applause. What had begun as a response to tragedy had become a model program, with schools in neighboring cities asking for guidance on starting their own. After the presentation, people gathered in small groups, talking excitedly about next steps. Captain Johnson made his way to his son through the crowd. "You did good, son," he said, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Really good." "Thanks, Dad," Marcus replied. "How are things at the station?" Captain Johnson gave a small smile. "Better each week. The new recruits are starting with the right mindset. The old guard is coming around, slowly but surely." A young reporter approached, notebook in hand. "Marcus, can I ask about your college plans? I heard you're considering law school now instead of business." Marcus nodded. "That's right. I want to focus on civil rights law." As the reporter jotted this down, Marcus caught sight of a familiar face at the auditorium door. James Torres, one of Officer Dawson's previous victims whose case had been reopened. The man gave Marcus a small nod of acknowledgement before slipping out. Later that evening, the Johnson family walked together to their car. The spring air felt fresh and promising. "You know," Lisa said, "sometimes I wonder what would have happened if that woman hadn't recorded the video." Captain Johnson shook his head. "I try not to think about it." "I do," Marcus said quietly. "I think about all the people who didn't have videos or whose videos didn't change anything. That's why this can't stop with me." As they drove home, Marcus looked out the window at their city, unchanged in many ways, yet profoundly different in others. What had happened to him would always be part of his story, but it was no longer the whole story. The slap that was meant to put him in his place had instead propelled him toward his purpose. The officer who hadn't known he was a captain's son had accidentally helped create something neither of them could have imagined. A young man determined to build bridges where walls had stood for generations.